We're losing profits, but we're also losing control. There's a lot of pressure from US government and US corporations about regulations. We also lose people. Many talented people go over to the States. The Americans can, as it were, pick and choose, particularly with scientists and technology. These are symptoms of a state that's working for another state and is controlled by another state. Even in military terms, Britain is useful to America. We are, to some extent, a sort of American aircraft carrier sitting off the coast of Europe. Thatcher started this. She would be horrified by how far it's gone.
Angus, let's just go straight in. Okay, vassal state. Britain essentially has become the smaller and subservient partner to America.
Absolutely. Much more so than people realise. You go down the high street and you look at companies like Boots and you think nothing of it, but that's an American company. You go to Costa Coffee and you're buying from Coca-Cola.
Are you?
Yeah, absolutely. You go into a supermarket and you buy what you think of as British goods like Weetabix or Cadbury's, and you find that they're American owned. And then, of course, there's all the things that are very obviously American owned, like Kellogg's and Uncle Ben's rice, and both all the dog food, main brands of dog food or cat food. The Americans have a huge stake in the British economy, much more than people realise. And it's not just this retail, this consumer goods that I've been mentioning, but also business to business. So the MOD, the NHS, central government are buying hand over fist from American corporations.
I want to talk about all of this. Let's start with the sort of more consumer products then. So that you talk about this in the book. You talk about these sort of British heritage products. You would assume that Cadbury was British owned. When did that happen? When did that takeover happen?
So that was about 20 years ago when Cadbury was bought by Kraft Foods, but many have been bought more recently. And that was a very typical takeover, that some of the manufacturing was moved to Poland, undertakings that were made. Well, it's arguable that undertakings that were made during the time of takeover were broken, the staff were reduced, the prices were increased, the organisation had more gearing, and it was probably run more efficiently. But either way, the Americans kept the British brand names and used those brands to sell into other countries as well. Cadbury is quite an interesting one, because what it does is it illustrates one of the benefits to American companies of buying British consumer brands, that Britain represents a gateway into Europe for America and a gateway into the Commonwealth. So Cadbury's had a lot of distribution in African countries and so on. And so it wasn't just that the Americans were able to take over the British markets. Through a British company, they were able to have more influence in foreign markets.
And what's that got to do with? Is that our relationship, our proximity, or is that something more sinister? Is there more access to tax relief?
Well, certainly a typical American takeover involves the reduction in the amount of tax that the company pays. So yeah, that's a big factor, and it makes the takeover more affordable for American companies. We've seen a lot of recent takeovers as well. I mean, of the 6 or so biggest defence companies in the UK, 3 of them were sold to America in the last 5 years. A company called Cobham, a company called Meggitt, and Ultra were all bought, and the government didn't do anything to stop it. They didn't block it, and now, of course, it looks silly. But they need a policy of stopping foreign takeovers, and in particular American takeovers.
But why would they have? I mean, if you look at the last administration, why would they have stepped in to stop that? I mean, you talk about Rishi Sunak in the book, and you're actually talking about it more in terms of his relationship with the tech industry and the unicorns that he was so excited to entice over to the UK. But I mean, overall, the Conservative mantra would be a small state, right? So would they want to be involved in prohibiting the free market?
Well, right-wing governments in many countries do have an element of protecting national champions. America does. America wouldn't allow its companies to be taken over in the same way. Indeed, they've challenged the inroads of foreign companies in their markets, such as TikTok. So they and Germany and France, they again, fairly right-wing governments, they wouldn't allow the takeover of their national treasures.
And you've got the pharmaceuticals, haven't you, that they're furious about at the moment? Donald Trump in particular, furious that Ireland has taken over that business.
Absolutely. Well, Ireland's a very interesting situation because it, in a sense, is a vassal state of America. Its economy is so dominated by US corporations in terms of employment and in terms of its tax, the government's revenue. But it's a slightly different sort of vassal state because it's got a much smaller population, and Ireland is really a gateway into the UK for American corporations and a gateway into Europe. And as a result, the Irish have done quite well out of their vassalage.
Right. So how have we become a vassal state?
I think progressively, governments over the last 20, 30 years, but particularly since 2008, 2009, governments have turned a blind eye to it. They haven't cared. They haven't measured. I mean, my experience in writing this book was that the numbers weren't known. So when I asked the British government how much the turnover how much of our GDP was from US corporations, they said, we just don't know. But I got hard, definite, clear facts from the Americans. The Internal Revenue Service in Washington, they have the numbers and they publish them. So we can see, for example, that $800 billion worth of sales in the UK, which is effectively about somewhere between a quarter and a third of our GDP, is from US corporations. And not only do they pay relatively little tax, but there's another really interesting characteristic about US corporations here. They tend to control very important parts of the economy. So they own what I think of as the pipes and the bridges, the pipes through which commerce goes, that they go down, the bridges over which we have to cross. So that if you rent a cottage, say in Wales, from someone who's in London or in Wales, you'll be paying a royalty of 7% to Airbnb if you do it through Airbnb. If you sell something secondhand, you'll likely be paying eBay. So they own these. I mean, even something like Amazon. If you buy something on Amazon, there's a very good chance you're buying it through Amazon, but not from Amazon. So you'll be buying it from a UK trader to a UK person, and you're paying a royalty on the way. But even bigger than that, whenever we trade at all, we almost always use credit cards. MasterCard, Visa, Apple Pay, Google Pay, Amex. These are all US corporations where a small royalty from every transaction that we do is going to the US.
And can you speak about this to me in layman's terms? You know, for the people at the back, why is this a problem? Because I think the argument that would be presented by certainly some politicians would be, well, it's wonderful having foreign investment because it means that the onus is on them, and also that means that there are jobs and infrastructure provided to the UK.
Yeah, I think it really matters because what's happening is we're losing profits every year are going to the States. So it's a sort of Danegeld, it's a payment over to the States. And both on those profits, very little tax is paid. So we're losing profits, but we're also losing control. So that there's a lot of pressure from US government and US corporations about regulations. So we lose control. We also lose people. Many talented people go over to the States so the Americans can, as it were, pick and choose, particularly with scientists and technology people. But we also lose treasure in a couple of £1 billion, a lot of money, a lot of value, a couple of £1 billion of art treasures go across the Atlantic to the US every year. So we basically...
Why?
The Americans buy up, particularly organisations like the Getty Museum, they buy up our art. I've got a couple of examples in the book of sort of high-profile cases where British galleries had have first dibs, have the opportunity to buy these things before they're exported, but they just don't have the money. The Americans are much wealthier, and so they've been buying steadily and exporting to the US. And in a way, again, many people would say there's nothing wrong with that, but I would say these are symptoms of a state that's working for another state and is controlled by another state, which is, I think, a definition of vassalage. But it's not just about that the value goes there, but it's the number of British people who are working for American corporations. Again, the numbers are public, and if you add in Uber drivers and Amazon Flex delivery people and the indirect workers, there are 2 million people working for US corporations in the UK. That's a lot, 2 million, but by comparison, in France or in each of France or Germany, it's more like 1/3 So
Really? Wow.
we're really dominated by US corporations, and it's not just about trade. It's also about control of the social media. So I mean, Twitter, Facebook, these platforms are controlled from California. And so when there's a discussion about at what age should people be allowed to go online, that's not a decision that's made in Westminster. That's a decision that's made in California.
And this is what you're talking about with regulations, the sort of the pressure of regulations. It's interesting because we're sort of still in the post-Brexit epoch. And, the big argument there was we wanted sovereignty. Well, the Brexiteer argument was we'd like to be in charge of our own laws. But you wouldn't think that America was dictating the way that our work regulations or practices are played out. But they then do have a de facto soft power. They are regulating us.
Absolutely. I mean, I give in the book one particularly strong example where the British decided that they were quite happy buying Huawei equipment, which is Chinese equipment for the telecoms infrastructure. And the Americans said, oh, no, you shouldn't do because it's a security risk. And the British decided, this was when in Trump's first presidency, when Boris Johnson was Prime Minister, they decided that the British decided to investigate and check whether it was safe. And all the security experts in the UK said, it's fine. We've looked into it. We don't think there's a security risk. We can carry on buying Huawei equipment. And Boris Johnson announced that we were going to make up our own mind. And Donald Trump and Pompeo, his Secretary of State, said, actually, no, you're not. You better stop buying it. And there were a few days of silence, and then the British climbed down and agreed that they were going to exclude Huawei equipment from all the British telecoms infrastructure. So that was done, in effect, at the diktat of the American government. And that's just a particularly public example. There must be many more behind the scenes where the Americans decide what the British government can do.
Well, I was thinking about that in terms of Uber, because that's, there's been a long fight to unionize Uber. There's also been a recent High Court judgment that Uber would have to pay sick pay and holiday pay, and that actually translated into, less benefits for the workers. They actually had to take their holiday pay out of the pay that they earned, which was a wonderful result, as you can imagine, for the workers. Yeah. But as an American tech company then, so we've always had stronger employment rights than America.
Yes.
But we are round the back door then importing their more lax attitudes to work.
Absolutely, and that goes for Amazon warehouses and most of the corporations that employ a lot of people in the UK. From America, very reluctant, very anti-union, really. So it's a very different culture. And it's a different culture in lots of other ways. It's a much more sort of winner takes all, devil take the hindmost attitude, which is very sort of un-European, not nearly the sort of caring, we're all in it together attitude that's much more common in Europe and has been historically in the UK.
And also that attitude, it doesn't really work here, because we are so dominated by American companies. So, I mean, you talk in the book about how tech companies that have grown in the United Kingdom will just be usurped by the larger sort of parent companies or organizations in America.
Absolutely right. I mean, there was a very good London-based AI company called DeepMind,
yes.
And that was taken over by Google, and no government minister stopped it or there was no policy to stop it. And you can see why the founders would have been interested to take, even if they had great faith in the company, would be interested to take the cash now. And you can see why individuals would have wanted to sell out. But I think in other countries, the government would have said that's a national champion. We want that to stay British owned or nationally owned. So the tech companies take over other companies, but they've also been very successful in growing right into not just into our homes, but into our phones, and so we're so dependent on US tech. And when people talk about big tech, they really ought to talk about big US tech, because there's very little which isn't US owned. And so the big 5 US tech companies have each worth over $1 trillion, have just absolutely penetrated the UK economy. And that, together with the traditional US multinationals, so Exxon and so the oil company, and the many food companies and so on, they've done a lot. But then there's a third force which is not so well understood by people who are outside finance, which is private equity. And private equity is an American-born beast with many heads. There are many, and again, when people talk about private equity in the UK, they're almost always talking about US private equity, companies like Apollo and KKR and Blackstone. These are companies who they're very brilliant at what they do, but they're essentially wealth extractors. So they buy undervalued companies, they load them up with debt, they cut costs, where appropriate they increase prices. They do sometimes grow the companies, but in effect what we're doing is we're transferring our crown jewels, or they're being transferred to US ownership, and usually I would say the private equity companies pay very little tax.
Because there was certainly an impetus from the Labour government before they got into power, or even in the first couple of weeks, actually, where they wanted to go after these private equity firms. There was a lot of talk about carried interest and increasing the amount of tax that was paid, and then that sort of all fizzled out.
I'm afraid it did, and there was also within the first few weeks there was a lot of talk about how the government wanted inward investment, but it turned out that inward investment was largely US companies such as Amazon building data centers. So they were really essentially reinforcing the power of US tech companies here. So that inward investment the whole inward investment question is very interesting, because the government always say how important inward investment is. But I spoke to the statistician who's mostly responsible for measuring it for the ONS in Newport, and he said to me very clearly that they mix together two very different sorts of investment. So an inward investment that's, say, a Japanese company building a car plant, which wasn't there before, and building cars which it sells across the UK and across Europe, that is a sort of inward investment that we want and politicians welcome, and we probably all should. It's creating jobs, it's creating wealth. But that is put in the same bucket, according to the ONS, as an inward investment, which is just the sale of a British company, an existing profitable British company, and it's all treated as inward investment. So when Jeremy Hunt, the previous government's chancellor, said that we're up to £2 trillion worth of inward investment, he was absolutely mixing chalk and cheese. Some of it was good and some of it was bad from a national point of view.
What sort of effect does that have?
What it means is the government aren't able to direct their policy towards the sort of inward investment we want. Mm-hmm. So they support, and that's true in a lot of areas, that they support American expansion, whether it's useful to us or whether it's just American takeovers. And I mean, we've seen that in lots of areas where, R&D research, for example, is heavily advantaged by tax subsidies, and that is intended, I think, to promote British research and development. But it's also available to subsidiaries of Facebook, Meta, and subsidiaries of Google. So the tax subsidies are not targeted at growing and promoting British-owned businesses. They're available to anyone. Consequently, many of these corporations will do their R&D here, and as soon as the subsidy goes, they'll move it to another country.
And this is something that Rishi Sunak was very big at. He was keen to push. He was keen to push sort of tax breaks for big companies who wanted to come and invest here.
Yes, absolutely.
And what ramifications has that had?
I think it's encouraged effectively the takeover of the UK's economy, and particularly the profitable parts. I mean, the Americans are good at business, and nothing I've written in the book is anti-American. I mean,
and you stress that. You stress in the book you're not anti-American.
Absolutely, I'm recognising the power of what they do and the effectiveness. It's just that. So my book is really about what the British response has been, and British response so far has been to welcome them with open arms. And of course, the recent developments with the new Trump presidency absolutely put the British in a dilemma. Do they carry on with this being in thrall to the Americans, which is what they've done so far, and Peter Mandelson's statements have clearly shown that? Do they continue to be sort of almost worshipping, or certainly welcoming of the Americans, or do they say enough is enough and we need to do something to be closer to Europe?
I find it very interesting in terms of tech companies and the regulations that are being imposed on the United Kingdom, because there has been a lot of talk for a number of years now about this Online Safety Act, and it's been watered down. And to be honest, it wasn't particularly strong in the beginning. So now it almost feels like a piece of paper rather than anything that's going to be effective. And you think about what we're talking about when politicians were attempting to combat the issues presented by these tech companies. We were talking about a spike in young people committing suicide. We were talking about extreme eating disorders. We were talking about a mental health crisis that is permeating the country. And what should be done is curtailing the intrusion that these tech companies have on the children of Britain. But what you're suggesting with your premise is that potentially is not going to happen, because America are setting the regulations and there is no way that they would want to limit the access that they have to potential consumers.
But it still could if there was more determination by government to. You could call it economic nationalism, but it's more a question of having the elected government having control. Just to take an example, Twitter has become very unfashionable for reasons connected with Elon Musk's behaviour, and so people have moved. But they haven't been encouraged, which I think they should have been, to move to a British-owned platform. In fact, they've moved to Blue Sky, which no doubt has many strengths, but is another Californian-based company. So the sorts of controls that I think you would be advocating are just not possible, much more difficult to enforce against a foreign company.
Mm. And all of that, there's a lot of money to be made on tech platforms. Why don't they tax them?
Absolutely. Well, this is where economic issues and political power overlap. Donald Trump has made quite clear that in order to agree a trade deal with the British, he will only do it if there's no digital services tax. So the digital services tax is a way of taxing the tech companies. The French have also introduced one and want to keep one. And the idea is that, well, it's too hard to work out what their profits are, so we'll charge them on the basis of turnover, and that way at least we'll get some tax from them. Of course, they employ very few people, so national insurance doesn't raise much tax from them, and they can, if they want to, and they usually do, they can move profits offshore in many different ways, but mostly by transfer pricing, making payments to US or offshore organisations for use of the copyright. So, you're right, we need to tax them more, but it's difficult when we want a trade deal with America and the Americans make it a condition of such a deal that we drop our digital services tax. But there's another element to the question of tax, which is that for a long time there have been many companies, particularly US ones, who've paid either no or virtually no tax. And the way they've done that is through the offshore tax havens. Now, the British are in quite a difficult position there, because of the 13 major offshore tax havens, the British control the territories of 9 of them. So places like the British Virgin Islands, Jersey, Guernsey, and so on. So we've got to, Bermuda is another one. So we've got to do something about those if we're serious about stopping the US corporations using these offshore havens. But they'll find other ones to use. So the logical thing to do is to have a global tax deal. And the Americans have agreed to that, again, subject to conditions that suit their companies, reduction of regulations and many other things. But that global tax deal will be on the basis that if in doubt, the tax is charged at the headquarters, the place where the company is based. So the majority of multinationals are based in the US. So it will actually raise a lot of tax for the US and not a lot for Britain. And the other thing is they've agreed this outline global tax deal on the basis of a global tax rate of 15%. Now that's much lower than the UK corporation tax, which is 25%. So it will still leave the US corporations at a competitive advantage. When a global tax deal was being discussed 25 or 30 years ago, they were talking about a tax rate of 25 or 30%.
Wow.
So in other words, it's not just about discussions between countries. It's about the whole philosophy on what the rate of tax should be, the general rate, typical rate of corporation tax should be, is being imposed on Britain and Europe from an American right-wing perspective.
I want to go back to that trade deal that you were talking about that has been in the offing with the US probably for, well, I mean, you could argue since the US's conception, but, it's certainly been in the news for the last 5 years, almost daily.
Yes.
It was something that Boris Johnson was desperate to secure in the post-Brexit years. But it goes right back to, easily Tony Blair, but you talk about Gordon Brown and you use him as an example to our sort of subservience to America.
Yes.
And the sort of jokes that the Americans have about the quote-unquote special relationship.
Yes.
And you almost say it's a fantasy.
It's a fantasy. It's used by the Americans. I mean, the first interview with the new ambassador from America to London, she had, in a relatively short interview, she used the term special relationship more than 20 times. And it's said that, and I'm sure it's true, that behind our backs, the American diplomats laugh at the expression and just say, don't forget to use the expression a lot when you're talking to the Brits. A lot of people, when we look at the raw economics, we can see that special relationship is a sort of give and take relationship. We give and they take. It's not a, and yes, in the past it has given British politicians access to American politicians, and we saw that with Tony Blair, less so with Keir Starmer. But access isn't power. It's useful to talk, but it's not useful if you can't have any influence.
And I suppose, the Americans did really take during the Blair years because we had, that's sort of the moment where we see a lot of American drugs enter the market and the NHS becoming dependent on them. And then, the sort of glaringly obvious example, which is Iraq.
Yes. We acted as a sort of fig leaf or handmaiden for them. We allowed it to be the Iraq invasion to be seen as not just an American operation. So they were very keen to have British support, even if it didn't amount to much in military terms.
We made it more palatable.
Yeah, but of course, even in military terms, Britain is useful to America. We've got, there are about 13 US bases in Britain, and people don't kind of notice them or think about them because they're badged as British bases. RAF Fairford, for example, and there are more than 10,000 US military personnel in the UK. So we are, in this sense, we do sometimes, for those who kind of look through the public appearance at the actual numbers, it does feel like we are to some extent a sort of American aircraft carrier sitting off the coast of Europe.
We're almost like a 51st state then.
Yeah, well, there's competition for who's going to be called the 51st state with the way America's treating Canada. But I think we've got the worst aspects of being a 51st state. So we are much more of a vassal state than 51st, because the 51st state would have votes, would have representation in Washington, and would have the opportunity to use the American legal system. So we don't have that. So we're worse than that. But in terms of being the 51st, we possibly are the 51st state, if we were a state, in terms of wealth. Britain is much poorer than people realise. We're either poorer than or about the same wealth as Mississippi, the poorest state in the US.
Wow.
So a 51st state can be used in a number of ways, but all of them, I think, illustrate Britain's subservience and its relative poverty.
Going back to the special relationship and this trade deal that has been in the offing, I'm going to ask you this almost feels like a bit of an empty question. I know what answer I'm going to get, but how much closer do you think that Starmer has gotten to that trade deal?
Well, everything's been up in the air, hasn't it? We've had 2 months today of President Trump, and there's much talk about flooding the zone, and he has done a lot. And there hasn't been any sign of much interest in, he's got big issues that he's decided to tackle in the US and abroad. And I don't think he's that interested in a trade deal with the UK. That's not very high up on the agenda. But I would say from Starmer's point of view, the challenge is, can he do a trade deal that will exempt Britain from tariffs? And everything indicates that he won't be able to so far. So that's not not encouraging. But the other thing about a trade deal is the Americans will make sure that standards, regulations are in their favour, because the Americans are very efficient. It's a big part, runs very much through American way of thinking and society, that they're very efficient and they do things at scale. And so if the regulations, food regulations, are quite lax, the huge volume of cheap food that the Americans can produce will then be imported into the UK, and that will be a really serious thing for British farmers and also for animal welfare. So there are a lot of dimensions. And health, yes, the health of the consumers. So there are a lot of dimensions to the trade deal, and it's ultimately a deal like that comes down to the relative strengths of the parties. And Britain is in a very weak negotiating position. And America has shown in the last 2 months, and before, but particularly the last 2 months, it's shown that if it's got strength in a negotiating position, it's going to use that strength to drive home its commercial advantage. I mean, we've seen that in the Ukraine discussions. You would think and hope that America would come in trying to save thousands of young men's lives and try to reduce the risk of the war escalating. You would think that when Trump said he wanted peace there, that he would be all about peace. In fact, it turns out that he's about minerals, that it's a commercial thing. So this is an illustration where the Americans are trying to use their strength to make money. And that, I think, will be exactly what will apply in a trade deal with the UK. And
that commercial interest that Trump has taken in Ukraine, that is also going to fall negatively or have a negative impact on the United Kingdom, because the conditions of securing peace between Russia and Ukraine is the United States gets access to a lot of minerals, to the ports, and a European army protects those interests on behalf of America. Is there sort of a trade deal that you can envision, which is the United Kingdom can trade freely, perhaps with the United States, but you've got to line your troops down on the border of Ukraine?
Yes, absolutely. I think there's a huge overlap between political, diplomatic and military interests and commercial interests. And the Americans are always happy to use one to support the other. But I think what we're seeing is an absolute turning of it really is a turning point in how the Western world is organized, with America basically abandoning or making moves to abandon Europe's defense. And so the Europeans are transforming their attitude to defence and realising that they need to be self-sufficient. But one of the consequences of that will be that they'll be less interested in supporting American industry. But Britain then is left absolutely stranded between the US and Europe. As the US and Europe each become more independent and start to move apart, Britain isn't sure. I mean, it's as if two barges are moving apart and Britain has a foot on each barge. You have to decide which way to jump. And at the moment, the British are trying to keep a foot on each barge, and the Prime Minister Keir Starmer is saying, "Oh, there's no conflict. We don't have to decide between the two. We'll keep them both happy." But he can't. He's got to decide on many issues. He's got to decide which way to jump. And the argument of the book is very clear that we should be jumping towards the Europeans. They're 20 miles away. America's 2,000 miles away. Of course, culturally, we've got something in common with both, but I think we've probably got more in common with the Europeans, with a more collective and a less capitalistic view of the world than we have with the Americans.
But isn't that the problem, though, the problem that the book highlights, that we are so entwined with America that if you were to pull the plug tomorrow, everything that we use on a day-to-day, at some point you're encountering an American product. So, I mean, what happens to card transactions that, if hypothetically we were to fall out on such a magnitudinal scale, commerce.
Absolutely. We are so intertwined and dependent, but we can reduce the intertwining, we can reduce the dependency. I mean, I think we're capable of organising our own credit card payments, and indeed we were. We had our own national credit card company owned by a bank called Access, but that got taken over by MasterCard. So we could set up our own ways of transacting business, and we could supply a lot of what we need, or we could buy it from Europe. But I mean, the good thing is, of course, even if we separate ourselves somewhat from America, then at least the Americans will still want to supply us. Because if you get a new knee joint or hip joint, it'll probably come from a company like Stryker, a US company. They'll still want to sell to us. And the NHS will still want to buy from them. I mean, they make some of the best products in this field. So I don't think a separation will stop the Americans wanting to do business.
But then I'm just sounding like a real apologist here, but is there not a danger when you've got a president that's acting in a manner that some might describe as spiteful, where, the conversations that he's having with Europe and increasing tariffs are because Europe won't take their cars? He said he had a conversation with Angela Merkel where he asked her, how many Chevrolets do you see driving around Munich? But we've got all of your BMW and Mercedes. Is there a possibility here when you've got someone who acts perhaps as cagey as Donald Trump does, if we began to withdraw as a nation from certain parts of America, could that not provoke a trade war?
Well, indeed. I mean, all that sort of thinking, all that calculus reflects the fact that we are a vassal state, that we're really not in a position easily to make our own decisions. But I believe at the edges and in some important ways, we could choose more independence and we could choose to be nearer to Europe and less dependent on the US. But I mean, you've talked about the American attitude to negotiating. I mean, the thing is, the British do have some levers they could use, but they need to be conscious that they're doing that. They need to make an effort, and at the moment, I don't think they're doing that. So
they're encouraging the opposite. Is that
they
what
are.
you mean?
They're absolutely. Their side. They take just as Donald Trump in the Ukraine war, from a European perspective, seems to be taking the wrong side. The British, in a bigger sense, seem to be taking the wrong side between the US and Europe.
What does this mean for the exchequer? You talk about Rishi Sunak and you talk about we sort of danced all over, but which is my fault. But you spoke about Rishi Sunak and this sort of press release that he released, which was attempting to encourage or entice companies to invest in the United Kingdom. And through tax breaks, that was sort of the incentive. How much is the exchequer missing out on by this sort of inward investment?
A huge amount. I mean, the whole impact of US economic dominance has been a real hit to tax revenues. And you can see that when you look at the turnover of US companies. Roughly speaking, 800 billion of sales, roughly speaking, 80 billion of profits, roughly speaking, 8 billion of tax. So sort of 10% tax and very highly profitable sector. So, and the consequences of that affect us every day. This isn't a sort of arcane exchequer question. This is cutting of benefits. This is raising of tax to UK. This is raising of national insurance. These things are linked. When the Treasury doesn't have money, it has to raise it by taxing you and me more. And when it doesn't have revenue, it has to cut its spending. So the US dominance has a direct effect on how well off we are, how much tax we have to pay, and how much our government can afford to spend.
So we're subsidising American companies at this moment in time?
We're subsidising American companies, but we're also subsidising America as a whole, because those companies are paying tax to the US and they are employing US citizens back in the US. So yeah, we're in a servient position, which we've allowed to grow up, and which I think to some extent, I mean, no economic or political conversation is complete without a reference to Thatcher. I think in a way Thatcher started this by encouraging a free market in companies and a free market in trade to an extent that hasn't been beneficial to the UK. But I think she would be horrified by how far it's gone, by how many British assets and treasures have been sold off, and also by how much just of the standard stock market is American owned. So when Thatcher was Prime Minister, 3% of the stock market was owned by Americans. Now it's over 30%. So a typical British company, like BP, for example, 30% of its share register will be American individuals and American corporations. So I think I think not only did she start it, but she would be horrified in how far it's gone.
It's an extraordinary statement.
Yeah, and also how much she would be. We should all be aware of how small the British stock market and the British economy has become. So, for example, if you take all the UK quoted companies, not just the biggest ones, not the FTSE 100, but the next 250, so the FTSE 350, if you take all of those and say, what are they worth? That together they are worth less than Apple. And they're also worth less than Microsoft. So each of those two US companies is worth more than all our companies put together. We are small.
Stunned me into silence.
Sorry, I don't mean to do that.
Is there a solution?
There aren't simple solutions, but I would say we need to start by measuring more. And I was horrified in writing the book in finding how little the British government measure about this. I mean, one illustration is when I asked ONS how many employees, how many of the British employment market is American. They said, well, we don't know, but we've got access to Dun & Bradstreet, and we'll look it up there. Dun & Bradstreet is an American publication. So,
but as you said, the Americans are keeping track of all of this.
The Americans are very good at their numbers, and they're very, very numerate on all this, and they follow the numbers. So the first thing is we need to measure more. The next thing is we need to stop the takeovers. We need to it's quite conceivable that a BP or Shell will be taken over by American company or the biggest banks or GSK, pharmaceutical company. It's very conceivable any of these companies could be taken over at any time by American corporations, and there's nothing to stop them from a government policy point of view, and there should be. So the first thing is measure. The second thing is stop the takeovers. The third thing is we need to, in general, get closer to Europe so that we concentrate our trade more on Europe, which is closer and culturally closer. And I think finally we need to recognise the special relationship for what it is, and stop being so willing to work for the Americans. It's not easy, and there's a lot to do. But the biggest start is right at the beginning, right at the top. The government needs to reorientate itself and face Europe rather than facing West.
Well, I hope that a few of the Labour advisors who I know who listen to this podcast, hopefully, they're listening now. I'm writing that down.
Well, I'd be happy to debate any of this and give any of my numbers to them. And I've had quite a lot of interest from on the subject from policymakers, and I've been speaking to a committee of the House of Lords, which is doing some work on the question of why homegrown technology is so regularly outcompeted or taken over by American corporations. So I'm keen to help any policymakers who can help the UK in its current predicament.